Go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to our, what is this? This is March, our March past meeting, as we are now officially the Panhandle Archaeological Society of Texas. I'm Erin Frigo. I'm the president of the Panhandle Archaeological Society of Texas. And tonight, our guest speaker is Ray Sumner, talking about the days after Colorado's darkest day, recontextualizing the response to the response of the Sand Creek Massacre. Um, Before I give the floor to you, Ray, I want to remind everybody to kind of turn off your speakers until it's time for Q&A, just to minimize interference. And if need be, I will mute you as well if you can't figure out where your speaker is, because sometimes it's a little tricky. Um, and also, if you're gonna be like, if you're watching this like on your phone or something, and you're gonna be moving around and bouncing around, you might want to turn off your camera just to minimize some distractions. But other than that, Ray, I'll hand the floor to you. If you're talking, okay.
All right, thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to get the
You're
share
fine.
going as I try to unclick the mic. Quick introduction to myself. My name is Ray Sumner. I am a PhD student at Colorado State University. I work under Dr. Jason LaBelle, that some of you know. I am a fully functioning member of now understanding what all but dissertation means, because all I have to do is write that damn paper. And now I understand how you go through 3 years of master's, 3 years of of PhD classes, and then don't finish your dissertation because you get a real job and no one cares anymore. But anyways, my research is on the what basically happens in the Plains Indian Wars post the Sand Creek Massacre. As you'll see on my slide that I hope everybody can see. Can you see that? Let me go to full screen. I'm a retired U.S. Army officer, and as you hear throughout this, I come at that from that really that ontology and epistemology of spending 22 years on active duty, 4 years as a ROTC cadet, so 26 years of my brain being programmed as a military planner. And I think it's very useful to the study of the Plains Indian Wars because it gives a lot more credit to the Native Americans. They weren't just going out and killing every white man that they could see. I'm sure they took great pleasure in that, but it's a much more complicated and much more strategic tactical operation that they're committing. So about half of the presentation is history, how we get up and through. I think that gets overblown a lot of times in looking at events in the Indian Wars as discrete events, but many of them are built on decades of previous actions and then have ramifications for years afterwards. So with that, I will jump into it. Real quick overview of what I'll talk today. And for those that aren't familiar, Julesburg is basically located in the armpit of Colorado and Nebraska. If you're from Colorado, you refer to the armpit originally to those that live in Nebraska. The Nebraskans refer to Julesburg in Colorado as the armpit in a pejorative way. Mostly, I think it's Omaha and Denver referring to both sides of the border in a pejorative way when they say it's the armpit of the two states. But it's that corner where Colorado and Nebraska come together in the Nebraska Panhandle, then goes west above the top of Colorado, as you see on the map there. Bottom photo is a picture of what it looks like today. Camp Rankin is the Army post in 1865. That'll be the center of this conversation, as well as the stage station that started out as a Pony Express station in the 1860s. As I said, the darkest days, I use that name for this talk in my research. It came to me a number of years ago. In that, if you look back in Colorado history, most people would tell you that the Sand Creek Massacre on the 29th of November, 1864, when Colonel Shivington, with elements of the 1st and 3rd Colorado Cavalry, attacks Black Kettle's village within their reservation, right where they're supposed to be, is clearly one of Colorado's darkest days. That goes without saying. To contextualize the 3 to 500, depending on the numbers and who writes the report, with the civil, mainly women, children, and elderly. There were warriors there. There were firing back, but clearly it was a massacre by any name. The events in November of 1864 at Sand Creek are so egregious that within months, the Department of War, now the Defense Department, is conducting investigations into it, categorizing it as a massacre, which for that time period is almost unheard of. Connor, who later is involved and we'll hear about, General Connor, he did the Bear Creek Massacre in 1863. It gets him promoted. It's normally not a thing that gets you chastised, but uh, it was so egregious what Chivington did in November 29th, 1864, that it even is immediately chastised as a massacre. They actually investigate him for bringing him back on active duty. They lack the authority. He left the military by the time they got to that in early January 1865. So they couldn't court martial him, but they immediately commence a congressional hearing, investigations into it. And so even at the time period, it is recognized as a ethical and moral failure. One thing to highlight about Colonel Shipington, we'll talk about a little more later, is as a retired Army officer, we're happy to say that General Shipington was a member of the Colorado Volunteers and such, and try to paint it that way. But in reality, Colonel Shipington is serving as the commander of the District of Colorado, a federal organization under which he's in charge of all forces in Colorado and reporting directly to General Curtis. So it is not simply a bunch of militia 100-day volunteers that go out and conduct this operation. It is by the senior military officer in the state of Colorado at the time. And again, we'll delve into that. I start my work off by saying it's the days after Colorado's darkest day. There's been tons of research on Sand Creek, so I'm not sure I could offer anything new. And more importantly, there's still a ton of politics, of course, around Sand Creek, how it's interpreted today. And I wanted to go beyond that because it wasn't central to what I'm talking about. It's very important, but I'll leave it to the experts that are involved with that, the Park Service, the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe of Oklahoma, the Northern Cheyenne and the Northern Arapaho, respectively, and their partners in telling that story. But what's sad is that after November 29th, there's very little talk of what happens in the immediate aftermath. And that's really what I try to focus on is what came next the day after the massacre and why does it matter to us today. If you look at a quick map, and I know you've done a lot of talks on the Indian Wars, so some of these sites you've probably talked about in the Central Plains to the Northern Plains. I know a couple months ago there was the presentation on the battle in Kansas in the late 1860s that he presented on. And if you look at all of those and go through this, you really see is there is the national government takes a lot of interest in the beginning, as do states of the Indian Wars, especially with the Sioux focus, Cheyenne and Arapaho as key elements of that. And then you go down through the time period to Little Bighorn. There's again much more interest in the mid 1870s battles. But if you look in Colorado post Sand Creek, there's very little tied to the federal or state governments where they're interpreting, trying to preserve what happened post Sand Creek. So in 1865 is Julesburg. There's a local museum. The battlefield belongs to private landowners. The Battle of Beecher Island in 1868 with Forsyth gets a lot of credit where Roman Nose, the Cheyenne dog soldier leader, is killed. It is only a local museum and a local organization memorializing it. If you go to Summit Springs, it's primarily only the local landowner, despite that being the seminal battle in which the dog soldiers are defeated in Colorado and leads to not only the defeat of the dog soldiers, but it's that battle in 1869 where Tall Bull is killed that leads to the Cheyenne Arapaho and primarily those two tribes being expelled from Colorado and forced out. That's when Chief Friday, who used to live in Fort Collins, where Colorado State is, got told he didn't have to He had to go, but he didn't couldn't stay, but he didn't care where he went, as long as it wasn't Colorado. And so they kind of wandered around with the northern Arapaho until the Shoshone let them join the Wind River Reservation a decade or so later. And so that's really the void in which I hope to fill a lot of this conversation. One good news story is the Park Service is actually working with the Tall Bull family descendants today to move forward on a nomination of Summit Springs as a National Historic Landmark. I won't go into a lot of the anthropology PhD theoretical requirements or in that side of the house. It'll be much more, hopefully, an interesting presentation. But I will say I approached this as an Army officer. I spent 22 years on active duty, most of that overseas in Korea as a campaign planner. So in my analysis, in my PhD work and dissertation, I'm trying to use the same act, what we would analyze a battle for. Because whether you're an American, whether you're a Native American, whether you're a Russian, whether you're an Iraqi, wherever the battles are, German, French, the ground, the terrain, how a military leader looks at planning an operation really are cross cultural in that regard. And as you can see from the slide, we could make even Foucault's head hurt by the amount of doctrine and levels of analysis and interesting things that the military presents on a daily basis. The primary one I'll talk about tonight is the levels of war analysis. In that, the main way I look at my research is looking at the strategic, the operational, and the tactical to really kind of understand what's going on beyond the tactical level, where Native American warriors and 7th Iowa Cavalry soldiers are fighting back and forth, to understand what the reasons are for that. And really to frame that up on the strategic level, to put it in quick context, is it is happening in the backdrop of the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War. So from the U.S. government, the focus is, as you'll see in the yellow where Colorado and the Department of Kansas is stability operations. They want to apply as limited amount of forces as they can to extract as many resources as they can, at the same time preventing the Confederacy from gaining access to whether it be agricultural or gold or silver that might be occupied within Colorado, especially. Their main focus in the Department of Kansas will be in that counterinsurgency area that you see around Missouri. That's where the leadership's focus is. Again, it's not on trying to figure out how to work with the Native Americans and tamp down things with that. They simply want as few distractions as can possibly be from what is to them the stability operations, using modern parlance. Real quick to walk through a few slides of kind of how we get to the conflict. Of course, the Louisiana Purchase is when the territory comes into play of the United States. At that time, as Hemelaken, who's a Finnish scholar, points out in his book on the Lakota, the only people in charge of the plains, we may own it in our own minds, but the Plains Indians still control the western United States at this time, and the Mexicans more. The coastal east of the Rockies entirely controlled by the United States for a number of decades, as we'll point out later. It's not until the 1830s, 40s that any sizable U.S. presence influences what's happening on the Great Plains. The first foray into the region is Lewis and Clark. They come through on their expedition. They make treaties and interactions with a number of Plains tribes that'll become pivotal to the conversation. The first American to foray into Colorado is Zebulon Pike. He initially, though, doesn't get a lot of credit, but he's actually goes up the Mississippi a year and a half earlier and purchases Fort Snelling, which is still an active Army reserve base in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. He purchases that from the Sioux, from the Dakota, in an attempt, they're hoping to push back the Chippewa, the Ojibwe that are pushing west at that time period. Next of important, when he comes here to Colorado, he goes down the Arkansas and engages with the Utes and some other tribes before he gets captured by the Mexican. Another event that really gets overlooked in terms of his impact in the West, because there's not really any battles, of course, west of the Missouri River in the War of 1812. But in terms of U.S. strategic policy, in the War of 1812 is because the British attempted to co-opt so many Native American tribes, and there were a number that fought with the U.S. In combating the British. But the realization that the Native American, the indigenous population, could be levied for military power, we'll come back to, comes into a great deal of play during the War of 1812. And so it's always just under the surface as a worry for the government's strategic planners and the military. Of course, the biggest event for Colorado is the war between Mexico and Spain, which leads to Mexican independence. At the time, there's only one Spanish fort in Colorado. It's abandoned shortly afterwards, after the Utes, we believe, massacred the Spanish garrison. And it was in the southern Colorado, south of the Arkansas River. Importantly, Long comes out in 1821 to Colorado, 2021 to Colorado, marches down the South Platte, comes down south to the Arkansas, and then heads back east, naming a number of peaks, engaging with tribes. But again, by these military expositions, and we'll talk a few more, throughout the 1840s, they're very small, and there's no real conflict between the U.S. military and the native tribes. Perhaps the most seminal event that happens to change the fate of North American Indian relations within Colorado is William Bent coming out in the 1820s as a trapper running goods to Santa Fe. And then in the 1830s, you, of course, have another seminal event that happens, which is the Indian Removal Acts. And I highlight these because we often forget, and you guys obviously are the Panhandle Archaeological Society there in Texas, but with the Panhandle of Oklahoma, and I'll admit the first time I drove down to go to one of the events at Perryton with Scott, it amazed me that it didn't dawn on me that Colorado and Nebraska, or Colorado and Texas now through Oklahoma, are only separated by about 45 miles and less than an hour drive time at modern speed limits, even with traffic lights through some of the small towns. And that really comes into play in 1860s during the Civil War, because we'll hear a lot that the U.S. is terrified of the Confederates organizing the 5 civilized tribes, and they're trying to. They fell spectacularly, never gained any traction, but they continually try to mobilize those 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma that were removed by the Indian Removal Acts and Jackson, to gain them as a military force that could march down the Arkansas River, the Santa Fe Trail. And once you're past Fort Lyons, right in the eastern corner of Colorado, there's no military until you get to Denver. And so that was part of the paranoia that builds into the psyche of what's happening in the American West. Again, moving on with Bent. Bent sets up his old fort in 1834, 1833, 34. And this is critical because this is what actually moves the Southern Cheyenne and even some the Southern Arapaho south, where they end up having their reservation created here in a few slides, because they want to do commerce with Bent in the buffalo robe trade at this point. And Bent then marries into the Cheyenne, the Southern Cheyenne. George Bent, his son, which we'll talk about later, is born of a Cheyenne mother, is raised by the Cheyenne most of his youth until she dies early in his childhood, and then he's shipped off to schools in the St. Louis area. Another key event, again highlighting, is the Second Dragoon Expedition with Dodge that comes in the 1830s, comes west into Colorado. I just highlight, if you look at the map, it shows a number of names that we wouldn't normally associate post-Treaty of Fort Laramie with those regions. It shows the Gros Venturas. It shows the Blackfeet far south of where we would normally associate them with. And I highlight this because it really shows one of the problems we have in history and in archaeology, anthropology, is a lot of what we think of the Native Americans today is a snapshot on the central and northern plains based on where people were in 1851 and the map that Father de Smet made for the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851. We'd be remiss not to talk about George Fremont. He comes across 5 times the West, 3 times in 1840s, twice in the 1850s, heading west, doing recons a lot with Kit Carson. Obviously, other Native American Indian War have a lot to do with Kit Carson in New Mexico, especially, but Arizona, a little bit of Texas. As you look again, what another instance that starts the tensions is the migration. So when the Mormons get kicked out of Nauvoo, they go to Council Bluffs, at the time Canesville, and start prepping to go east. Over the next 20, 25 years, tens of thousands of Mormon immigrants come across the plains. As they come across, and we'll talk the Oregon Trail as well, more and more Americans are coming across the plains and driving the bison, other goods further away from the water source of the North and South Platte River. And that increasingly drives up the tension between the Plains tribes and the United States government. There's some more immigrants on the California Trail once gold is discovered. And that gets us to 1851, and the tensions are clear. They're going to happen. The U.S. government signs the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 and uses these definitions of what are the different tribal lands. And if you were to take a map today, and I work a lot of Section 106 consultations with all of these tribes, this is literally how the U.S. government today, 75 years almost later, views their tribal reigns. Court documents, lawsuits, the U.S. still comes back to this document to really look at and say whose area is whose. And it unwittingly, even though the treaty doesn't say this is the only areas they can go, has become a really focal point, which they still push back on today in litigation against the U.S. government. In the 1850s, again, the Oregon and Mormon Trail really have picked up. At this point, settlers are looking for new ways to find locations to get west. They don't want to go up Ash Hollow. They don't want to have the problems in Nebraska coming up at Old California. This last one is Fremont's 5th expedition. I like to show this because it's an amazing photograph to me from 1853 at the Big Timbers, just south of the Sand Creek Massacre and where George Bent was born. This literally may be the teepees lodges in which George Bent was born in the early 1850s. This is a photograph of the Southern Cheyenne camped at the Big Timbers on the Arkansas, a few miles east of Bent's original old fort. It's amazing to me that there's a photograph from 1853 in Colorado, and of course Bent's fort there. Again, this is a period that continues to pull the Southern Cheyenne further south to put them in what will happen to be their reservation in 1864 and 1865. The tensions really begin on the plains in 1865 when the 54, excuse me, when the Battle of Gradden Massacre happens. The Gradden Massacre. There's a lieutenant from Fort Laramie goes out with some troops in response to what's called the Mormon cow incident. A cow gets slaughtered by the Lakota on the plains. They go out and have a discussion with the Conquering Bear and some others. He tells him he can't make the Miniconju. He's a Sikangu, Burnt Thigh, Rosebud Sioux, today's nomenclature, that he can't make him surrender. And suing in their discussion in the village, a fight breaks out. Still argument about who fires first, and a massacre occurs. 32 American soldiers killed. One guy survives and lives to tell the story. The next year, Harney marches out with troops from Leavenworth, comes up into Nebraska, and then has the Battle of Ash Hollow, or the Battle of Blue Water Creek, in where he attacks Little Thunder's village, another rural Sioux who had absolutely nothing to do with the first incident, but just gets massacred on one morning. Dozens of injured. Crazy Horse is actually there, Spotted Tail, others that'll become pivotal in the battle and see what happens, and are very impacted by it. The impact carries on today. In my work at Colorado State, one of my tribal cultural specialists is actually Little Thunder's great-great-grandson. If you're interested to look up the Smithsonian's latest magazine, and you'll see him on the article there talking about the legacy of the Battle of Ash Hollow today. Because of the area and the tensions increasing in parts of Nebraska, and again the trouble at going up Ash Hollow for the travelers on the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails, they continue to look for a new route, and eventually they find Lodgepole Creek at Ovid, Colorado, which is about 8 miles southwest of modern day Julesburg. It's a stream that runs from Ovid, where it enters the South Platte, about 150 miles or more into the foothills of the Laramie Mountains west northwest of Cheyenne. In the 1860s, this creek would have had water in it year round. Even today, with farming and damming, there's still water in this creek. It's frozen underneath the ice that you can access today. Another pivotal event in 1850s that really shapes the battlefield that happens in 1865 is Colonel William Voss Sumner. Later, Bull Sumner becomes a two-star general in the Civil War, one of the longest-serving Army officers. He and Major Sedgwick, his deputy, for which Sedgwick County, Colorado, was named another two-star general in the Civil War. He's a major at the time. They come out to punish the Cheyenne for their actions in primarily Nebraska in the mid 1850s. One goes down the Platte, the other goes down the Santa Fe. They meet back up and they come and catch the Cheyenne at the Battle of Solomon Forks, which is ironic because Bull Sumner's an old Civil War or cavalry officer, dragoon at heart. So he orders a cavalry charge against the Cheyenne that morning. And mysteriously, the Cheyenne had to convince themselves they had a medicine against bullets that morning. But Bull Sumner decides to charge, doesn't use the rifle. He uses the saber. So in the end, they turn and run because they didn't have medicine for sabers chopping off their heads. And I think one soldier and three of the Cheyenne were only killed. So it's a minor skirmish. But that becomes important again because it's the increasing conflict in the 1820s, 30s, really the first 50 years of U.S. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho interaction. There's no conflict. It's only in the 1850s with the mass migration and the impact on resources that it has that you start to see the conflict arise between the Plains tribes and the U.S. military. Another seminal event is the founding of gold on Cherry Creek. This really causes the most problems because at least before, the people going to Oregon and California and Utah were passing through the plains. With the advent of gold in Colorado, now it's a continual flow to the southwestern part of the central Great Plains, with people coming down the Platte, initially attempting to come across Kansas to come and find gold in the Rockies here in Colorado. Another key event that increases tension is the Pony Express. And again, building stage stations, at least with the settlers passing by, they were just moving down the roads. So really in 1860, when the Pony Express and the Mel contracts go into place, you start to see every 10 to 15 miles a settler support facility, be it a swing station, a home station, a terminal station, whatever the names may be. There's now a lot more permanent settlement, a permanent impact that the tribes are seeing. And with the Pony Express, these are originally all along the Platte and then the North Platte. And then in the 1860s later, we'll see that it becomes an issue along the South Platte. So again, you're having much more in the 1860s conflict over resources as the buffalo get pushed further and further away. The Native Americans are pushed away from the water sources. That's what inspires the conflict of the late 1860s and throughout the 1870s. In the 1860s, initially, you have the Treaty of Fort Weiss, becomes then Lyon, Fort Lyon. Governor Weiss was a Confederate, so he joined the Confederacy when the war breaks out. So we renamed Fort Weiss to be Fort Lyon. Of interest, on the day the Civil War started, Jeb Stuart was sitting at Fort Weiss Lyon, Colorado, as well as Major Sedgwick as members of the U.S. military stationed there. But you'll see that massive truncation because of the increase of settlers that happens during 1861. And now you really have the tribes in a situation for the Southern Cheyenne where there's no way to sustain yourself. They're not supposed to go out and hunt outside of that area. There's not a lot of buffalo. There's not a lot of other game. You're really forcing them into a dead man's land between the Arkansas and the South Platte River, where there's not a lot of opportunities for anything. If anybody's been on the Republican or any of the other Smoky Hill Trail tributaries, between May and the fall, there's almost no water in any of those rivers. So there's not a lot of options unless you can sustain yourself around the Arkansas and the South Platte River in Colorado. Of course, the major event is the start of the Civil War, and that's really important because prior to the Civil War, you had trained Army officers, West Point graduates, people that had lived in the West for years, if not decades. And what happens with the Civil War, all of those lieutenants, all of those captains, colonels, the few generals, they all go back east to become the colonels, the generals that are running the Confederacy, that are running the Union Army, and they're replaced by mobilized reservists, what we use today, by militia members called up by newly formed regiments that have no training, no idea about the Western United States. And so you just create, not only you're creating a void with competent military officials, you now create a void in leaders that have any idea about how to engage with the Plains Indian tribes. The Pony Express goes broke once the transcontinental telegraph goes in place in 1861. 1863, it makes its way to Julesburg. And then the Overland Stage takes over and again builds a massive network, even more than the state Pony Express, across the plains and into Wyoming and Utah to run mail and telegrams all the way in passengers to California. Again, interactions and stressing that piece with the Native Americans. Another key event to keep in mind that really triggers, I think, in my mind, a lot of what happens is the Dakota War. We don't think of it a lot of times and its impact on the Western Plains. But in 1862, when the Dakota Uprising occurs in Minnesota, a lot of those people that survive run west, cross the Missouri River, and go into the Dakotas and into Nebraska, and even as far into Wyoming and some maybe even to Colorado, but definitely have interaction with those plain tribes and hear the stories of what the U.S. did in response. And what the U.S. did in response is the largest mass execution in U.S. history. At one time at Mankato, and is still memorialized every year by a ride by the Lakota and Dakota to the site, the United States government hung 38 Dakota Indians for their involvement in the Dakota Uprising. President Lincoln commuted well over 100 of the sentences. Originally, it was about 160 or so that were sentenced to be hung. He said only those that were by testimony had raped or murdered someone could be executed. The rest were sent to my hometown. Never knew this until a few years ago, to Davenport, Iowa, where they were imprisoned for the remainder of the Civil War until they were released. But those that did not get imprisoned or their family members, many of them ran west and started talking about the atrocities of both sides and the ability to resist. Not only was there conflict, though, among the U.S. and the Plains tribes during the 1850s and 60s, really throughout the 1800s, you have the Sioux moving westward, especially the Lakota, getting pushed west by the Ojibwe, the Chippewa, as they're being pushed west by other tribes in the Northeast, in the Northwest Territories in Indiana and Ohio. They come west, and of course, because of their decades, centuries almost, interaction with the French and the Canadians, the British and the Americans, they have much more firearm capability than the Lakota and the Dakota do. And so they quickly get pushed to the west. There's conflict between the Sioux and the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara. The reason those three tribes today are known as the MHA Nation are primarily because of obviously smallpox and other diseases, but also between their conflict with the Lakota. Coming together was a way that they found to push back on the Lakota and some of the conflict between the tribes in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. There's also conflict between the Sioux and the Pawnee, and then the Cheyenne and Arapaho in the mix, who are very closely aligned to the Lakota and the Sioux as they come west. And they, again, as they get into Colorado, especially along the Front Range, come into conflict with the Utes. Not shown on this slide. While all of this is happening, the Comanche, the Plains Apache, Kiowa are being pushed further and further south to where we think of them today in the modern 21st century. And of course, while they're all competing for less and less resources because of the Anglo-American influx through their territories, you have an increasing amount of conflict between the tribes, not just increased conflict between the U.S. military and the tribes at the same time. For note, one of the most noted Ogallala band leaders in this time period gets the name of Pawnee Killer. I don't believe he got that name by chance, but again, highlighting the amount of conflict between the Pawnee and the Lakota. A lot of the Pawnee's strategic movements, not to delve into it too much today, with their siding with the U.S. government, is a means to protect themselves and to find a way to push back against the Lakota pushing into what had historically, by their claims, been their areas. Looking at the operational level, this really for the time period is the Department of Kansas. General Curtis is in charge of it. His primary focus at this time period is what's going on with the Confederacy in the far northeast corner of the department. He could really give a rat's ass of what's happening in Colorado, now Wyoming, and western Nebraska, as long as those political leaders are not demanding more forces to help out maintain what's going on in interactions with the Native Americans at that time period. Looking at the leadership at the time, you'll see General Curtis on the left. He's actually a former congressman from Iowa. We have him to thank for the Pacific Railroads Act that created the Union Pacific. The other commanders in the region, as I mentioned, Colonel Shivington, he's then replaced by Colonel Moonlight from Kansas, General Mitchell, and others that are involved on the American side. Of course, finding the U.S. military officers is easy. It's much harder to put the Native Americans back into the story. But we do know from looking at the bands and tribes that are involved that Spotted Tail, not yet the leader of the Sikangu Burl Sioux, was involved. He had become much of a fond of trying to find a way to work out a way to keep his culture alive, working with the U.S. He was not a pacifist. He saw the egregious behavior at Sand Creek, and so was involved in the initial responses. Black Kettle was involved even after the initial attack on Sand Creek. He was still present at the war councils. We mentioned Pawnee Kill and Little Thunder. Morning Star was a leader of the Northern Cheyenne. We believe he would have reached here at least by the end of the second Battle of Julesburg, which we'll talk about. You'll see some of the others on the right-hand side. And then on the far left corner, you'll see George Bent. William Bent's son actually fought with the Cheyenne and Arapaho and the Lakota throughout 1865. He was with his mother's family sitting in a lodge at Sand Creek in 1864 with his half-brother as well as his future brother-in-law. Needless to say, they were a little upset about getting shot at and getting shot during the Sand Creek Massacre. There were 3rd Colorado Cavalry personnel that were going to execute them. Fortunately for them and the U.S., that members, I believe, of the 1st Colorado and others that knew William Bent from the region recognized them and stopped their execution. And so they were paroled eventually to go back and hang out with their father. And then were still kind of upset and went out with their mother's family for the rest of 1865. We do know that Red Cloud and Sitting Bull would have not come down for the battles by where they're at by the historical record. However, we do believe that it is likely, most researchers, that Crazy Horse would have come down by the 2nd of February when the Second Battle of Julesburg happened. And we know he was hanging out with some of his Cheyenne friends or relatives at that point, and which is why that assessment is made. And I highlight that because when you look at a lot of these names, later on, these are the same individuals in their youth who later on fight throughout the 1860s and 70s against the U.S. And I'd offer really what this period is almost, for a lack of a better way to explain it, they're fighting reservists from the U.S. that aren't the most trained, under resourced, and they're successful, as we'll talk in a moment. And thus, it's very much like a shot of crack or heroin. You can defeat the U.S. Army. Sadly, though, in a few months after the first battle and second battle of Julesburg, the Civil War ends, and the U.S. sends all the resources west with hardened soldiers that have fought the combat against the Confederacy. And the reservists, the militias, go home, and it really changes that dynamic. But I think this is a time period in 1865 where a lot of the younger warriors, later leaders of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota, and somewhat the Kiowa, get an experience that you can defeat the U.S. military, and shapes their views for later on when the strategic and operational and tactical setting has drastically changed. Real quick, too, on Colonel Shivington. He becomes the lead of the Colorado District of Colorado because of his success at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. He happens to be a major and stumbles upon the field trains with the help of the New Mexico militia and destroys them. So the Confederacy has to retreat from Glorieta Pass back to Santa Fe to get resupplied, and they never go north again. But in 1863, when this happens, 62, 63, when all of this is going down, the people in Denver and Colorado, the feds are terrified, again, not only about the Confederacy coming up the Arkansas River, but coming up through the Confederate Texas into New Mexico, coming up what is now Highway 25 and marching on Denver. Had he not bubbled into the wagon trains, the Confederacy was successful at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. If they had not been forced to retreat, they could have marched past Glorieta Pass and likely would have taken Denver because most of the troops at Fort Union and out of Colorado had already come south to engage them. But again, I highlight that as that paranoia that exists in Denver. Looking at Sand Creek a little quicker and understanding how it happens before we dive into its response a little bit, is what's happening on the plains in 1864 and 65. There's a great deal in early 1865 conflict between the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and some of the Lakota, the Ogallala, and Sikangu in eastern Nebraska. It drifts more and more west throughout the year. But again, as you see by the reds, the primary focus for General Connor remains on what Pierce is doing in the borderland of Missouri and Kansas. Again, all of his forces are there. You have one regiment in Wyoming and western Kansas, a regiment in Colorado, and a regiment in central Kansas, the 7th Iowa. So 3 regiments worrying about massive amounts of territory, super spread thin, no ability to exert military power against any other organization. And all that is, again, the department is focused on what's happening with the war, with the Confederacy, understandably so. One thing really to understand about Sand Creek and why it happens and its impact that I'll talk a lot more about in my thesis, but I'll throw out here as or my dissertation as a teaser. This is General Connor actually gets ordered in October of 1864 to take command of the South Platte River Trail, the Overland Trail, and command the whole thing and defend it. That had already happened a year before with General Ford and others at Fort Lyon taking over the Santa Fe Trail and the Arkansas River access into Colorado. So when this happens, Colonel Shivington, who twice been nominated to be a general, both times denied by Congress for various reasons, is sitting in Denver being told in November, you're about to lose everything that you're in command of. He was literally about to become the commander of Denver. Not a very exciting job to have if you want to become a general officer. And so General Connor comes out, tries to bring a couple company of cavalry, can't get him past Fort Bridger. He comes on the stage with Benjamin Holliday that owns the Overland Trail, and he sends back this telegram on the 21st of November, 1864, less than a week before Shivington leaves Denver to go do the massacre. And as you'll see there in the writing, he says, I got no troops. Nobody will give me troops. There's not enough troops out here, even if you gave me all the troops to do anything. You're going to have to send more resources. One thing General Halleck in D.C., General Curtis doesn't want to hear, I need more resources to do anything against the tribes. And then says, as you see there in red at the bottom, I do not deem it wise or prudent to undertake or advise a campaign against them. So he literally says, don't do anything against them. We don't have the troops. It'll cause more problems than it will solve. He gets on the stage, goes back to Fort Bridger and Salt Lake, and then 3 days later, Shivington leaves Denver, and a week later commits the Sand Creek Massacre. And in doing so, Shivington does exactly what General Halleck says will, or excuse me, General Connor will say happens, which is we're going to stir something up. We don't have the forces to handle it, and we're going to pay the price for years to come. Wisely, in hindsight, he was dead on. He prophesized what would happen. And really, you could argue that the outcome of not listening to General Connor is the next decade of war between the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and the Lakota, which results and culminates at the Battle of Little Bighorn and the demise of Custer and the 7th Cavalry. Also, it's important to note, not only is it a massacre, ethical, throw all of that out. The Dog Soldiers, the other warrior societies aren't there in 1864 at Sand Creek. So all Shivington does is kill, and we'll show this on the next slide, the political leadership of the Cheyenne that can restrain what happens after that. And so by attacking Sand Creek, moral, ethical outrage, Shivington militarily is bigger, perhaps, as the failure. He drives the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Lakota into a military alliance, which was tacit at best prior. He convinces them to conduct operations in the winter, which was never done. And then he convinces them not only to conduct military operations, but go on to a large-scale, full-scale offensive operation for the next 6 to 8 months until General Connor comes back in the Powder River campaign to stop that operation. As I mentioned, here's kind of an outline of the tribes based on the ethnology, oral histories, and research I've done. The key thing on the right there is the Cheyenne, is the Cheyenne. The Cheyenne actually have a civil-military divide. They had a council of 44, 4 ceremonial posts are picked from the previous 10-year council, and then a new council is picked with 3 members from each of the 10 bands of the Cheyenne. That council gives guidance to the warrior societies on what to do. You can be on the council and a member of a warrior society, but the leader of a warrior society, the leader of the Dog Soldiers, cannot be on the council of 44. So in the attack on Sand Creek, the estimate is Shivington basically completely eliminated or decimated at least 4 of the 10 bands of the Council of 44. So not only does he do all that stuff to ignite the war, he then eliminates, by his actions on the civilian population, the one thing that can restrain the Cheyenne warrior societies, especially the Dog Soldiers. Post Sand Creek, there is no longer a civilian ability, Black Kettle or others, that were in favor of accommodation to work anything out with the U.S. government. The Dog Soldiers, the other warrior societies, are free to do whatever they wish for the next 3 to 7, 10 years. Jumping into the battle, much more diving into the archaeology here after this slide. What happens in Julesburg, if you look in the books now, mostly written by avocational historians, there's not a lot of academic archaeology, anthropology, or history done on this period post Sand Creek. It's really Sand Creek, and then you jump to 1876 and Little Bighorn, Rosebud, and the other events on the central northern plains. But what the Cheyenne Arapaho do is a much more organized military operation than they've ever been given credit for. If you look in the upper left, the time and distance, it's not a coincidence that they attacked Julesburg. It's the warehouses for the Overland stage. It's the distribution warehouses. They have 500 people from Sand Creek that they now have to take care of throughout the winter. If you don't find additional goods, food, clothing, tonnage for them, household goods, they're going to strain your own and your family's going to risk dying. So they have to find resources. So when I talk this, I will definitely refer to what they do at Julesburg and up and down the Platte as conducting raids, not offensive operations, not attacks. They're going somewhere for a specific reason and then leaving. They have no interest in occupying Julesburg. They're happy to kill as many people as possible, but they're going there because they need the supplies. They go to every ranch up and down the South Platte River Trail between Fort Morgan and North Platte in the 3 months in January to March because they want the supplies, the cattle, the goods, and they're the soft targets. Why not go raid those? Why would you try to raid Fort Kearny and get supplies when you can get them from somewhere else? So the battle starts on January 7th, 1865. They attack Julesburg. They actually have skirmishers out all the way down to Sterling, attacking Valley Station in past Alkali, fixing the ability of U.S. forces to respond. And so when you see those 2 to 3 day marches, they know all of those. They put forces out to interdict people and hold them so that those forces can't interdict them in their flanks as they attack around Julesburg. After that, they divvy up the battlefield between the three tribes, between the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota, with the areas they're most familiar with. And then they proceed on about a 6 to 8 week campaign throughout Colorado, Nebraska, and to gain as much supplies and to do whatever they really want along the South Platte River Trail. They start out in the week after Julesburg by attacking between Fort Morgan and Sterling, burning every ranch and stage station but Fort Wicked. A number of times they engage the small detachment at Valley Station, and then eventually move on to attacking that directly the next week. And again, attacking and burning every single ranch showing here throughout that week. Again, every time gaining cattle and supplies. George Bent will later write that he's never seen more goods and supplies in a Native American camp than he does in January of 1865 during this period. At this point, they're moving everything back down to St. Francis, Kansas, and then coming up with war parties to attack. The next week, what they do, though, is they move up their camp to what is the border of Sedgwick and Logan, Colorado, where the Jumbo Reservoir just south of there today. And they set up in the middle of the South Platte Valley with some 700 to 800 lodges, somewhere between 5,000 to 8,000 Native Americans. This may likely be the third largest gathering, definitely of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota. The two other bookends of that would be the Battle of Little Bighorn Camp, in which they were doing the Sundance, and then the camp at the Treaty of 1851. And you're sitting in a valley with 800 teepees, lodges, having war dances in an area that you can see for miles and miles around. And it's really a giant middle finger, to use kind of the Top Gun reference. There's nobody that can do anything to you. They are not scared of the U.S. military. They put their massive campsite, within 50 miles of Valley Station and within 50 miles of the military base at Julesburg, symbolizing that there's no one that can touch us here. We are in control. We own the offense. We own the initiative here during 1865 in January and February. They then continue to march in on Julesburg a second time, burning all the stage stations as they reapproach Julesburg. On the 2nd of February, they send the camp north to the North Platte River near Rush Creek, which we'll talk again later. And then at the same time, they attack Julesburg for a second time. Holiday, after the first attack a month later, has resupplied all of his warehouses at Julesburg because Holiday doesn't get paid unless the U.S. mail makes its way west. And that's where he makes most of his money is through the mail contract. So he has to keep delivering the mail. And to do that, he has to resupply the warehouses. So they come back to the Walmart distribution center a second time. This time they fix the military in the fort, don't really attack it. There are no military casualties, but they hold them there while they raid the stage stations and take all the goods and services, this time north into Nebraska. Quickly in Nebraska to look at the campaign overall before diving into the day of January 7th, the 4th and 6th, Colonel Collins comes out of Laramie. If you ever wondered about why Fort Collins is named Fort Collins, it's named after William O. Collins, who was the commander of the 11th Ohio Cavalry at this time period at Laramie, the Western District Commander of Nebraska. His son was Casper. He is killed at the Battle of Platte River Bridge in Casper, Wyoming, which is why Casper, Wyoming has that name. So many of the places, not knowing it, most people don't even recognize it that live here on northeastern Colorado, southeastern Wyoming, Nebraska are all tied to this very time period. So one thing I hope to do through the archaeology is really to create the maps on the left. The only map of the battlefield we really have is Bent's map that he drew some 40 years after the battle, working with George Hyde to create a book on his life. And it kind of shows their migration, where they camped, and things like that. As you'll see, the 700 lodges on the February 2nd, and those indications that he has had. So it is unique in that we actually have an American speaker that took notes and provided commentary over what happened in the battle. So my ultimate goal is to hopefully recreate one of these maps, and I do that looking at the battle of the day. Really, all when I started this 7 years ago was there were 15 military killed, 4 civilians. We think 35 Indians and a chief. And yeah, we had a battle. It was about 2 paragraphs of a military report. I use a lot of technology trying to figure out and put things into the right time horizons. You have a ranch, then you have a small military fort, and a much larger post-Civil War fort. So it was a lot of trying to piece artifacts into the right time frame to help us understand what happened. Try to use a lot of different technology to use that. As a historical archaeologist, I use a lot of history, primary and secondary sources, and then I've applied a lot of technology: view shed analysis, LIDAR, multispectral imagery, thermal imagery, as well as getting on the ground and, of course, doing more traditional metal detecting and archaeological field work. Trying to piece that all together, what I'm doing is trying to find things that I know exist from the time period. We know there's a flagpole at Camp Rankin, there's privies, there's trash pits. We know there are telegraph poles. The original transcontinental telegraph crossed the South Platte River at Julesburg, and then in 1863 was built west to Denver. We know different fighting positions, building placements from the blueprints, and so we're going out looking for all of those using the different technology. Using LIDAR, and I'll go through these pretty quick. We used LIDAR initially, as you'll see on here, 3 anomalies. If you're not familiar with LIDAR, it shoots out thousands of lasers every second, bounces back, and then a computer processes them to show minute differences in elevation. So these 3 anomalies showed up. To highlight them on the left, you'll see one on the top is transected by a canal that was built in the early 1900s. So whatever those anomalies were had to be built because they're cut by the canal prior to 1900. The middle ones are 2 anomalies, and you'll see the kind of the structure of the different, and they look like mounds when you look at them on the surface today. And then at the bottom, you'll see an L-shaped, upside down L flag going to the east with 6 90-degree angles. Mother Nature doesn't make a lot of 90-degree angles. So when you throw that on a map, which overlays the blueprint of later Fort Sedgwick, you'll see those rectangular buildings near the road in the canal. You'll see 2 officers' quarters that were made of adobe in this general area of the 2 central anomalies, and they have somewhat of the same internal structure that you'll see of those sod quarters. We know the other 2 are wood and were moved to Fort Sidney. And most of all, at that bottom left, you'll see the post hospital. which has remarkably almost the exact dimensions of that L-shaped anomaly in the bottom right. Another example where it's useful on trails, you can see the trail there where it shows the California here, just south, California Hill on the Oregon California Trail, just south of Ash Hollow. On the left is showing you where the Park Service shows it on the macro. And then when you drill in, you can see the actual cut, and right on the hill where they're dead on of where the wagons cut into the terrain in the day, the erosion that has happened, you can still see the exact spot and how the wagons went up California Hill over 160 years ago. Another example of LiDAR, just contextualizing it. This is Fort Union. You can somewhat see the Star Fort in the bottom left. If you look at the top right, you can see when you, I've stood there and I never could see any of this. When you use LiDAR, it pops right out to you and what's happening on the ground. And so I'm building a comparative database. The other piece I'm using the LiDAR for is to identify the whole terrain of the valley where the Camp Rankin, Julesburg Station would have been at, where the conflict was, and then recreate it and taking out all the modern features, the canal and other things eventually. So you can use VR, you can use augmented reality and stand there and look and see what the battlefield would have looked like in 1865. The biggest thing to note is obviously not just the canal and I-76, but in the 1860s, in between Lone Tree, Nebraska, and Fremont's Orchard, about 200 miles, there are no trees on the South Platte. There's nothing green. There's no wood. So it's a much more desolate world than you see today when you're standing there. Again, I'm using LiDAR, terrestrial LiDAR to trace buildings, to put actual period buildings from various places across the plains back in that diorama to be the buildings that on the VR, and not just try to imagine what they might have looked like, but to use actual buildings of that technology. Yes, if you're not paying attention, you can scan yourself, as you'll see in the bottom right of that, as I thought I was out of distance. But with a 360 scanner, sometimes you're not out of distance and you become part of the record.
Ray, I'm so sorry to interrupt. This is a fantastic presentation. I just wanted to let you know you've got about 10 minutes left.
Okay, I'm about done.
Okay.
All right. Again, 3D scanning, use a lot of thermal imagery right there, trying to thermal imagery, trying to identify features. You can see in that black, it's hard to see, but you see a lot of, again, 90 degrees, rectangles, other things, anomalies that you wouldn't, that really, when you marry it up, again, putting this as the metal detecting over that, those clusters, a lot of them line up where we're finding nails and the artifacts that you would anticipate to find under building structures. In the 1930s, you could still find wood on the surface of the ground here at Julesburg Station. Using the archaeology, again, another where it helps us is to identify where casings are fired and where the bullets are. Some of this I've heard in the previous talks. So we're primarily looking for the Gallagher carbine at the top that the 7th Iowa had. It was a 50 caliber cavalry weapon carbine that they utilized with a very distinctive bullet and a very distinctive casing. And so looking for those, we're trying to picture again where people are engaging the Native Americans from and where they're not. Probably the most notable find in all of this was finding a remnants of a 12-pound mountain howitzer. By finding those different things, knowing the range of that, we can begin to piece together the movements of the howitzer, which is another thing that had not been documented in the previous record. And most amazingly, we found one of those right next to the center of Julesburg Station, which we surmise is likely being fired on the actual day of January 7th, because there's not many other times you would fire a howitzer at the president's telegraph line. So in the end, what this has allowed us to do, piecing back together from the first one where we just said 15 soldiers were killed, we now understand that starting the attack, a small party tried to attack a stagecoach coming in to that. They were unsuccessful. It ran away. So then they had to attack a civilian train about a mile away from the stage station, 2 miles from the fort. Once they did that, the cavalry finally decided to come out and respond to protect the civilians. When it was just the stagecoach, they weren't real enthused about finding arrows in the dark. Next, the cavalry does come out and chases them off. At this point, the cavalry runs up in 3 detachments into the hills. And fortunately for the cavalry, as George Bent says, two of the Native Americans came out to their front about a mile away, and they saw them, so they knew there were more people out there. So they stopped. Otherwise, the entire 45 soldiers of the 7th Iowa likely would have been killed that morning. They fight their way back to the stage station, get the mountain howitzers, come out and blast away to get the rest of the civilians and folks back into Camp Rankin. At that point, those drawings you see on the left are actually drawings by the dog soldiers. This is the only time the dog soldiers went up against two howitzers that we know of on the offensive in a fort. So we know that their drawings, both by their recollections and assessment, by historians are the Battle of Julesburg. And that ledger was actually captured at the Battle of Summit Springs a few years later. Then they spend the rest of the day attacking Julesburg Station, getting their supplies and moving south. And in the end, with all of what I've just talked about and some newspaper research on the historical side, has allowed us to basically paint back together much more of what you would think of more of a Civil War map of showing the actions and when and how things happened on the battlefield. Through newspaper research, was actually able to find a number of accounts of soldiers writing back about the battle. And so from that 15 soldiers died that day, we're now actually able to say where those 15 soldiers died, who they were with, which detachment they were in, as you kind of show pictured on the slide there today. And with that, I'm open to any questions.
All right, we've got about 10 minutes, I'd say, for Q&A. And Scott already has a question in the chat. Where did you find the 1853 picture of Big Timbers?
It's out of the Library of Congress, actually. I was looking for something else. I don't remember what I stumbled onto it. And Fremont actually had a is it Caravallo? I'd have to look at his double check on the spelling and pronunciation. Glass plate photographer with him on the expedition. I can't imagine hiking glass plates over the Rockies, but there's apparently only 2 or 3 of the glass plates survived today, and one of at least the one with the timbers, sits in the National Archives, and it's remarkable that there's a picture from Colorado. You know, 6, 7 years prior to the gold rush, even.
All right, anybody else?
Ray, this is really a remarkable uh, talk that you've given us, and an amazing amount of research applying, and I salute you for it.
Thank you.
It's a lot of information. Fantastic. Thank you.
That was a lot of information. Yes, very, very thorough, I must say.
Look forward to the dissertation. All I got to do is scribble it down.
Yeah, I got to take 2 months off work so I can write it.
From a guy that took 10 years to finish his dissertation, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm only sitting on 7. So.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, Ray, that was a fantastic presentation, and thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Yeah, that was a lot, I gotta say. Yes. But like Chris said, that was very well done. Did we lose Ray?
No, I was sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry. All right. Well, thank you so much. And for anyone who doesn't want to be a part of the business meeting, we wish you all good night.
Thank you, Ray.